All right, Dr. Bekaroğlu, you can introduce yourself before we start. We cannot hear you. Your microphone is off.
Okay, I think broadcasting started, so I keep it short. My name is Edip, and thank you for coming today and talking to us. And we will talk later after your speech. Thank you.
Delighted for the opportunity.
All right, Dr. Gülboy, can you just give a brief introduction?
Yeah, thank you. I'm in the middle of my little girl's supper, so I'll take it brief. I am very honored to be at your audience, Professor Viotti. I'm Burak Samkülboy, Professor Burak Samkülboy. My profession is on 19th century European politics and the cause of the First World War, and more theory of war. Usually I'm very interested in your presentation, and I hope to be at the very last. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you. And the live broadcasting started. And Dr. Tashi, can you do that, or just we go on? All right. We will co-moderate the program with Dr. Kurtuluş, and she will give a brief introduction. And after that, I will read Professor Viotti's biography. And then we will have about 35-40 minutes, speech by the Professor Viotti. And then we will have a question and answer session after that session. Right, Dr. Kurtuluş, please introduce the program. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Begüm Kurtuluş from Department of Political Science and International Relations at Faculty of Economics. Our department has been organizing a special series of events, including talks and open lectures delivered by distinguished guests, distinguished professors around the world. And today we have the privilege and honor of hosting Professor Viotti from University of Denver, from Korbel School of International Studies. So it's really a great privilege and honor to host him here. We are looking forward to hear his talk today, and our talk will be moderated by Professor Dr. Ahmet Öztürk. He is the head of our department. And so first, I guess he will make his presentation about 30 or 40 minutes. And then afterwards, we will have the Q&A section. And if you have questions, you can write your questions in the chat room. So I'm giving the word to Professor Öztürk to start the conversation. So thank you.
Right, thank you very much. Let me introduce Professor Viotti to the audiences. And I know him for about 25 to maybe 30 years from University.
Has it been that long?
That long, yeah. Last time we had another program with Professor Donnelly. He told me that we had we had before a lot more hair than now.
Oh, yes. Well, I have a new hairdo. It's called a beret.
All right, you can confirm my case anyway. And I lost lots of hair in the meantime. Let me tell you about your educational background. Professor Viotti had his education at Georgetown University, MA in government program, and then an MS program in international business administration in George Washington University. After these degrees at those universities, Professor Viotti had his PhD from University of California at Berkeley in 1978. But before all those degrees, he had his Bachelor of Science in International Affairs at US Air Force Academy. As part of his professional career from 1992 to the present, he has been teaching and working at the KSAS, Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver, where I've been his student from 1996 to the end of 1997. Before joining to University of Denver, he was on the political science faculty at the US Air Force Academy, and where he was a deputy department head and then acting head during his service at this faculty. He had retired from US Air Force Academy as a colonel in 1992 after some years of service. His academic areas, Professor Viotti has been teaching on IR theories, national and international security, and on foreign policy, including US, European, and maybe partly Turkish foreign policy. And he has a number of books and articles on foreign policy, national security, and international relations theory. His institutional and professional affiliations include he has been a member of Denver Council on Foreign Relations since 1978 and its president from 1993 to 2003 and vice chair at the same institutions from 2003 to 2017 and emeritus board member since then. He has been active in American political science and international studies associations, and he has participated in professional associations such as American Political Science Associations and a number of others, including, as I said before, Denver Council on Foreign Relations. And today's topic is, of course, a security topic that, as we know, for the past 3 weeks, Russian invasion is taking place in another country, and there has been Western sanctions, facing or at least counterparting Russian invasion and aggression in Eastern Europe. And we see a unique case. I don't know if do you agree with me or not. Russia is attacking with full power and hard power, and the Western world is trying to stop it with soft power. Somehow, low politics, low politics versus high politics case. I can see, or I don't know, what's your opinion on that? Let me stop here and I'll leave the time to you, and you can start your talk, Professor Viotti. And thank you again for joining us tonight.
Thank you for such a generous introduction, and I also thank all of you for coming to this event via Zoom. We live in a very interesting period of technology where we can speak across the ocean and much of the European continent, and while at the same time our technology has also fueled war in ways that trouble me. We've had great advances in the sciences and medical science and all the rest, and yet we still have not solved this problem. We thought we'd set it aside following the Cold War, but it seems like we may be in another Cold War. Heaven forbid that we have to last as long in that Cold War, but it is a major challenge ahead of us. Having said all that, and we'll come back to it to some degree, the period, because of the threats that Russia has posed, not just to Ukraine, but to NATO members, to include your country, in principle, although I'm not anticipating an invasion of Turkey anytime soon. We're not in that period of ancient history, it seems, thank goodness. Nevertheless, the alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, has been strengthened, which was not Mr. Putin's intent, to be sure. But if there was a question about the utility of the alliance in the post-Cold War, now we are in what seems to be the beginning of another Cold War, and the essential element of allies collaborating in their common interests against any one country that would commit aggression against any of its members. So strengthening the alliance and other aspects, clearly Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty requires that the allies come together, although it doesn't explicitly say use force. It forces one of the possibilities allowed under Article 5. And we can put our heads together, perhaps even in the Q&A, as to what beyond what Professor Öztürk has mentioned, the softer response that we have made rather than use force, in this case dealing with a non-member of the alliance. But clearly Article 5 becomes important yet again. The only time it was used by NATO was to support the United States following the attack on what we call 9/11, when New York and Washington, D.C. in particular were under terrorist attack. And so the United States has a responsibility and also a bit of appreciation to allies who came to our rescue at that particular point in time. The North Atlantic Charter is totally consistent with the United Nations Charter, particularly on collective defense under Article 51 of the Charter in particular. And so we have a very legal arrangement of allies that is now strengthened even beyond its formal legal character, the degree of commitment, I think. Taking us back to the immediate end of the post-Cold War, there was indeed a debate on expanding NATO or NATO enlargement. One of the professors on whom I'm writing a book, he asked that I would be his intellectual biographer, Kenneth Waltz, a former mentor of mine, along with Ernst Haas, both of whom saw the world through very different lenses back in the Berkeley days. If you will, the realist Kenneth Waltz and we would say liberal constructivist Ernst Haas, even though the term constructivist hadn't entered the vocabulary yet in the 1970s when I studied with him. That's a term that he came to accept in describing his work. And so working with two very different scholars and create a dilemma for those of us studying them, since two very bright men saw the world through such very different lenses. But setting that aside, Waltz argued explicitly at the end of the Cold War against enlarging NATO. He thought that this would encroach upon the traditional Russian sphere of influence. He was in the same camp with George Kennan, a rather major figure in American foreign policy, who made the same argument that it would challenge, create sensitivity in the post-Cold War period. And I'm not going to endorse what they said, but they certainly predicted what we have. The rise of Vladimir Putin in the interim, it took a while for him to rise to his present position, but is kind of an iconic figure for that point of view, that the viewing NATO as having taken advantage of Russia at a time of its great weakness. The reality is, of course, it's a defensive alliance, and the states that border what was the Soviet Union, now the Russian Federation, had reason to come together and to expand the coverage of what is a defensive alliance. And so the Baltic states, which I've also visited, and clearly they feel extremely vulnerable, as does Poland, Hungary, Russia, Romania, and other states on that end of the Russian Federation border. And clearly Ukraine and Georgia have already both experienced actions that were prohibited by the rules-based order that we established following World War II. And certainly that's on our agenda looking forward. NATO did offer an olive branch in its own terms, the Partnership for Peace, extended to Russia, but not certainly membership in the alliance. I remember listening, it was a visit to Oxford in England to a visitor at the time, Henry Kissinger. And my son was then studying at Oxford, which is why I had access to the Oxford Union, which is where Kissinger was addressing the students and a few of the rest of us who were there. And he took the historical view of Russia and why Russia should not be admitted to the North Atlantic Treaty, because it well might become an enemy at some time, in which case we needed the alliance to protect the rest of us. And so that was a more traditional view, and he, as Henry Kissinger often would put that comment in an historical context in terms of Russia and the other countries that have had to deal with its expansion at different historical periods. And certainly the Cold War, its expansion didn't necessarily expand its technical borders, but did expand the sphere of influence to cover Eastern and Central Europe in the Great Line that divided East from West in that particular period. And so when we talk about encroachment, if you will, on the Russian sphere, we're really talking about encroachment on the Soviet sphere in terms of the countries in Eastern Europe that are now members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The other organization in Europe, the OSCE, Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, that includes the United States and Canada, and also Russia. So it's the more inclusive organization, but so far the diplomatic efforts through OSCE have not borne any more fruit than the other diplomatic efforts. Clearly, the European Union, and I'm one who supports Turkish membership. I shouldn't become too political here to talk about what your country, but if your country desires membership looking to the future, as it has in the past, you could count me on one who supports that. How can one deal with Europe without dealing with Turkey? I can read in the ancient writings translated to English how what is now present-day Turkey was also very much part of Europe as we understood it, mostly around the Mediterranean at the time. Be that as it may, the olive branch was not Russian membership, clearly. Now, I want to be very clear on my view, welcome other perspectives on Vladimir Putin, but clearly a narcissist in the extreme. I think psychiatrists or psychologists, I'm neither one, although I have a great deal of interest in human psychology, would even call it a malignant narcissism. I don't understand exactly how they measure that, but or what these units mean. But people above 60, whatever that means, are in another category. Narcissism is common in among human beings, so it's not an atypical form of personality. But in the extreme, we find it becomes extremely dangerous. Extremely dangerous. As one can see, among other characteristics, one lacks empathy. One can start wars and not care at all about the human cost that wars have. Narcissists are not the only ones who start wars, but when they do, it comes with a certain callousness, a lack of concern. For one is driving for one's own purposes. One wants an historical legacy. His legacy would be that of, by his own idealization of both Stalin, who after all came from Georgia, and Tsar Nicholas I. He is I had to do more reading on Tsar Nicholas I to understand his regime, but it was one of expansion of Russia and also an autocracy. And certainly we know a great deal more about Josef Stalin, those of us who studied, which we have, World War II, and both before and afterward. I was just a boy when Stalin died, And so even as a 9-year-old, what was I? Something like that, 9 years old, already understood who Stalin was. So it was so much a part of the American rhetoric at the time. Even though he had been our ally in World War II, he was portrayed as the embodiment of diabolical forces in the propaganda to which I was exposed in the 1950s. Late 40s, although I can't think I was much a part of that, having been born, I'll reveal, in 1944 as a, quote, war baby, just after the U.S. Invasion at Normandy. So this period of time that we're talking about is also part of my life, even though I had to learn about it secondhand as a child. And so with respect to Putin, his actions fit into a particular mold. And so although negotiations are continuing as we speak, I'm not terribly optimistic about that outcome. We need to continue the diplomatic effort, to be sure, but he has both autocratic and expansionist tendencies that are embodied by, if maybe the word hero is his heroes, I'm not sure that's the correct term, but at least his idealization of both Josef Stalin and Tsar Nicholas I deserves some study or reflection bias, as well as what I would say his extreme narcissist personality that lead to taking actions that don't fit our usual notions of rationality as the calm, cool individual who thinks through the ups and the downs of any particular policy choice and opts on the upside, not the downside. But be that as it may, the world is different today than it was before his intervention in Ukraine. And we can speculate on the aftermath, but it would seem to me Russia has painted itself under Putin into a corner from which it will be difficult to move back into what was the immediate post-Cold War aspect of moving further to the West. Moving to the West is an idea as old as of Tsar Peter the Great, but that we stand here in the year 2022 with a country that still is isolated from Europe, and likely will continue to be, notwithstanding many in the population who are much more comfortable with a more Western-oriented Russia than they are with the Russia that Putin is creating. So I'll leave that part there. I want to address, that part really ends with the construction of a Russia that is the restoration of what amounts to a Tsarist Russia. I don't see him as trying to restore the Soviet Union, but I find the Tsarist Russian metaphor to be more apt. There's only a marginal difference between the two, I would add. Okay, the response to Russian aggression, I want to call it what it is. It's aggression against a sovereign state, a member of the United Nations. All members of the United Nations have their sovereignty recognized purely by virtue of their membership in that organization. And the rules-based order following 1945 and the decades of construction of the post-war order, rules-based order, are embodied in the among other things, in the concept of sovereignty of a state. I think our response, which it is to keep open the doors to the extent to which we can to diplomacy in the UN, the OSCE. We have Russian-Ukraine negotiations going on bilaterally, European and US leaders, and in other fora. However unlikely their near-term success, we need to continue negotiations. Chapter 6 of the UN Charter has peaceful remedies peace should precede the use of force, which is argued in Chapter 7 of the Charter. It is a collective defense effort that NATO has, as I mentioned before, under Article 51, that allows for that. The collective security mechanism of the Charter, in its most forceful way under Article 42, cannot be used so long as Russia continues to veto, and we can expect Russian veto of anything that would smack of, whoops. Am I back? Okay. I dropped out for a bit there for reasons, technical reasons I don't understand. But in any event, I pushed the right buttons and back with you. I wish solving the problem between Ukraine and Russia were as easy as that. Economic sanctions are what we have come to. It's a strangling of the Russian economy, which Putin calls an act of economic warfare. Be that as it may, Russia and sadly, Russian people, whichever side they are, if they're watching state television only, they have a particular point of view, disinformation, but many, particularly younger Russians, have a better grasp on what is happening in Ukraine. And there are personal relationships, family relationships to Ukraine that also are an avenue of communication. The social media, to the extent to which Russians are tuned in, they can understand what is actually going on. But regardless of that, the Russian people as a whole are suffering great harm and will suffer more of the same so long as economic sanctions remain in place. I prefer economic sanctions to war, and so it may be necessary. My pipe dreams, and that's all they are, would be a palace coup showing Putin the door. I'm not talking about his assassination. I'd rather hold him accountable in trial for his war crimes, alleged war crimes, I would have to say, to be fair. But it's very clear to me that he's committed war crimes. And so that's a pipe dream of mine, not likely to occur, but I wanted at least to put it on the table. Another pipe dream would be a revolution in Russia. It's time for another one if things have gotten this bad. An autocracy with oligarchic tendencies is not, I would think, in the Russian people's interest, but I leave it to them. But the likelihood of another Lenin emerging, not to lead them to a communist outcome, but a Lenin revolutionary who would overturn the way in which the regime has come to be, would be another pipe dream. It's not going to happen, but nevertheless, I want to share that I entertain these alternatives to the present. We need the U.S. and NATO members to continue aid to Ukraine. Exactly how this will go, it depends upon the future scenarios. God forbid that Russia use chemical weapons in its effort to take cities. That will provoke perhaps a different response than the purely defensive one. I share President Biden's and others who share a fear of starting World War III. Exactly where these lines are becomes unclear to me. One would hope that the leaders of our countries communicate directly to Russia, not leave it purely to strategic ambiguity. I believe in strategic clarity among the leaders, even if we in the public may have to live with strategic ambiguity. I don't need to know personally what, say, Chancellor Scholz or President Macron or President Biden or any of the other leaders say directly to Putin. I don't need to know that, but I would hope that they make very clear that there are limits and that our present stance is not necessarily a permanent one, and so that we could indeed contribute to, for example, to Ukraine's capability to use offensive weaponry. I hope it's not too late to be talking about these things if current Russian moves basically take out its leadership and an attempt at regime change. I'm not sure that it may be too late to do anything more, but we at least need to continue doing what we are doing. And it may be necessary. It may be necessary to create a free zone for combat free zone in flying over Ukraine. But that is a provocative step. But depending upon what Russia does when it starts attacking supply lines going into Lviv, it becomes problematic to continue aiding Ukraine when, in fact, the supply lines are cut. And so I can see discussions occurring that would be defensive in character to allow our supplies. But of course, that'll be seen as offensive in Moscow. And so we're in a very dangerous period, as I think we all understand. Let me turn to, I should add one other controversial fact. I rarely hear it, at least in the United States, even spoken of, because it would be adversely affect our allies as well as Russia, whether Ukrainians or others would try to disrupt the sabotage the gas pipelines, I gather some cross Ukraine and other countries. That is something that's not spoken of, but that certainly would be a stranglehold on Russia, which depends for revenue upon its exports of oil and gas, but also our European allies who depend upon Russian supplies of gas and oil to maintain their economies and their basically populations able, for the very least in winter times, to put on heat. But in other ways, it would harm all of our European allied economies. It's much easier for the United States to cut off those exports. It only means higher prices for people putting gasoline into their cars, which has an adverse and asymmetric effect. People less well off economically pay a much higher price than some of our celebrities who have been celebrating that they don't care what they pay at the pump for their gasoline. Well, it's fine if you're a wealthy person to make that comment. So a lot of these sanctions effectively have adverse effects on ourselves. But I can imagine that disrupting pipelines is on someone's agenda without knowing or even trying to speculate whose agenda that would be. So those are things that I would, if I'm thinking about something, someone else may be planning it, is my basically my point of view on that. Let me comment on Russian military errors. As you know, I retired as a colonel from the Air Force. I was mostly a scholar working at the Air Force Academy in those years, although I did in my early years deploy to places like Vietnam for a year, 1968-69, in intelligence. I also served in the Defense Intelligence Agency in those days, 1969 to 72. Later, as a faculty member at the Air Force Academy, I was sent to Stuttgart to work in the U.S. European Command as a deputy political advisor. So I've focused on things military as well as politics. And I have to say, Russia has moved away from any canon I understand on the use of force. They certainly failed to achieve their objectives in a timely way that had been anticipated. Lack of preparation, logistical problems. Logistics is essential in warfare to be able to maintain your forces, to have, in some cases, food supplies 20 years out of date is problematic. Where was all the money going to? Was it going into corruption instead of into what their soldiers needed? As such, I find the just war doctrine or just war theory instrumental here in understanding how military should operate, even in their best interest. Although Clausewitz was not a moral theorist, he was the principal theorist of war, as I understand it. The way to win any battle, the way to win any war, is to destroy or substantially weaken the war-making capability of the enemy, not destroying its people. Figuratively, you waste bombs on people. That's a horrific statement that I've just made, wasting bombs on people. But essentially, in a military sense, you do not attack people, population centers. What you do is destroy the war-making capability of your adversary, not its population. In that sense, wasting your weapons because you're not reducing the war-making capability of people, the civilians who do not have a military capability as such. And so I think we learned from the theories of the 1920s and 30s of air power that the idea of obliteration bombing that was practiced in Europe by both sides with an intent to destroy the will of the people to resist was a bankrupt doctrine. Those you kill have no capability of resisting, but the survivors are enraged by this attack on human populations. And so this is very dysfunctional militarily if it emboldens your enemy. And clearly we see what's happening in Ukraine is emboldening the nationalist spirit, bringing together people of diverse political positions within Ukraine. And so this is not at all functional militarily. If Russia prevails by simply destroying the population centers, that's a total war concept that one does not find in any rationally organized military that I'm familiar with. And so we learned from World War II the failure of bombing population centers. It did not serve any military purpose and thus could have no moral content per se. It's mass murder. It needs to be called that. You can't really use, I guess, the case of genocide in the case of Ukraine because fellow Slavic people are being killed by Slavs coming from Russia. So we would use the simple phrase mass murder is the way I represent what is going on in Ukraine. And that's hardly a military doctrine and should not be elevated to any such level. So military necessity, once again, I define consistent with Clausewitz as the way to win any battle or any war, just or unjust, is to destroy or substantially weaken a war-making capability. And that leads me into what is the just war theory. It's emerged from ancient times. In Greco-Roman thought, particularly of Plato, and then a Platonist, Cicero, writes of just wars should be fought justly by legitimate authority. It gets taken up in the Western Christian sense by Augustine. Aquinas works its way in a more secular form into the father of international law, Hugo de Groot or Grotius, and the law of war and peace. Several other scholars and others writing on these things, finally becoming in part of formal international law in the Hague Conventions and then the Geneva Conventions. Other conventions dealing with topics as genocide and so on. So international law really has a moral base. And as we look through all law in principle that's good law has a moral base. I don't see the two as separate, but I see the moral as preceding what we formulate as law. But that's a subject that one could discuss at greater length outside of this context. But basically, if I look at the just war theory, what is your right to go to war, the jus ad bellum? It has to be a just cause. Clearly, in my view, Russia does not have a just cause, trying to reestablish a vision of Tsarist Russia. That is not a just cause for committing aggression against a sovereign state, Ukraine. So it fails on that point. Is it waged by a legitimate authority? Well, to the extent to which Putin's regime is a legitimate authority, that is correct. Is war a proportional response to a just cause? Well, it's not even a just cause, but if it were, the destruction of the population of Ukraine is hardly a proportional response. So we've already failed. The other 2 points being were peaceful remedies exhausted? No, hardly that. Diplomacy that you pursue until on some just cause until you can no longer resolve it that way. Can you get around to the right to use force, the jus ad bellum? And also another principle on jus ad bellum is that you have some chance of success. Unfortunately, Russia does have some chance of success here as they would define success. So basically, if I look at the traditional just war theory, it is immoral to engage in an unjust war. That said, just war theory also addresses what should occur in war, in principle, whether it's a just war or not. And so there's some really severe limits. And again, all these limits are aimed at dealing with warfare, which is a barbarous instrument of policy. It is never a good instrument of policy, even if it achieves good ends. World War II achieved a good end, but it was hardly a benign approach. It was barbarous. Many of the actions that occur in warfare are barbarous. And have we proceeded no further than that would be the question I would ask. In terms of just war theory, which underlies, again, our international law concerning such things, we have in the right jus in bello. What is right in warfare? And what is right in warfare is, first of all, to spare non-combatants. As the English would say, Americans tend to say non-combatants. However one produces the word, civilians who are not part of the military enterprise as such are not legitimate targets. You try to spare them. If in attempting to attack a military target, with all due respect and effort to avoid sparing non-combatants, some civilians are killed, so be it. That is the nature of warfare. But certainly targeting them directly is a violation of the jus in bello. And related to it is the question of proportionality. The weapons you use in warfare should be proportional to the military targets that would be legitimate military targets. Again, what are legitimate military targets? Those that enable your enemy to wage war, not its people. And so if you put arguably a 300-pound bomb on a target like a helicopter pad that could be taken out with a 300-pound bomb, instead you put a 10,000-pound bomb on that target, you're acting disproportionately and you're going to cause needless collateral death and destruction. Another element within the jus in bello is that you're not allowed to use weapons that are immoral in themselves. A gun is not immoral in itself. A knife is not immoral in itself. It can be used, as I like to say, a knife can be used to butter bread or toast. But the knife used as a dagger becomes not an immoral element in itself, but the morality is or immorality is on the part of the person committing murder. Some weapons, because they're indiscriminate or because they cause needless human suffering, are immoral in themselves. We generally count among these nuclear weapons, Although there are some would argue some tactical nuclear weapons can be constrained. I don't buy the argument, but we could talk about that in Q&A. Chemical weapons, because of their indiscriminate character and also because they cause needless human suffering, also fail to pass as legitimate weapons of war. Biological weapons, similarly, radiological weapons. These are the weapons of mass destruction, but beyond being weapons of mass destruction, they violate this concept of that weapons should be discriminate, not indiscriminate, should not cause needless suffering. So as Russia looks to its options, and when it pretends that the U.S. and Ukraine are secretly developing chemical or biological weapons, is clearly a lie, and it usually precedes Russian use of same, the false flag argument, as people are calling it. And so I'm worried about chemical weapons in particular. I'm less worried about them using biological weapons, which are more difficult for them to control because the biological weapons could spread to their own ranks. In World War I, both kinds of weapons came out of fashion precisely for that reason. But chemical weapons, arguably used in cities, particularly given the arms that Ukrainian citizens have, men ages 18 to 60, and some women joining in that, and some men older than 60, perhaps younger than 18, joining in that. I don't have statistics on it, but basically Putin has contributed to a nationalist response, the most effective in many ways. Armies is a citizen army, and that is what is emerging. And so if you go street to street in urban fighting, that could be very costly, would be costly not only to Ukrainians, but also to Russian soldiers. And so there's a motive there for use of chemical weapons delivered when their own soldiers are not in sight. I worry about that. It would be a major violation of law and morality, moral principle, and might evoke a much greater response from NATO members. If not all of them, then those who decide to take particular actions. One would hope that the alliance would move in concert as a preferred. So looking to the current and future agenda, since Ahmet put the agenda of future on this, clearly the ideal would be to defeat, or the objective would be to defeat Russian aggression without expansion of the war or its escalation. We don't need to start World War III, to put it another way. We want also to restore the rule-based order in Europe and the Atlantic area. This is very high items to achieve. We want at the same time to strengthen NATO and other multilateral institutions. We want to augment US and other allied forces, particularly NATO countries bordering Russia. We need to put up a very strong defense, meaning a willingness, if attacked, to consider the option of moving against Russia. The best way to avoid war, to keep the peace, is to prepare for it. Si vis pacem para bellum, as it would be said in Latin. Si vis pacem para bellum, if you want peace, prepare for war. Unpleasant, that is, to think that our civilization that develops technologies where I can communicate with you, as I indicated, by Zoom across the ocean and continent, has to deal with war preparations. What a diversion of our resources that should be dealing with human poverty, human concerns, human security issues. But seemingly, when we have somebody who's broken the rules, a necessity still to strengthen ourselves in an attempt, we hope successful, to maintain the peace. We need to keep NATO's door open to countries. Should Finland decide it wants to join, Sweden, or other countries, to include, when feasible, a victorious Ukraine. If God, I certainly hope that's the outcome with all this devastation. But Ukraine and Georgia, other countries that want to join NATO within Moldova, within the European Atlantic area. We need not expand to the world. We can simply attend to the North Atlantic area, in my view. But we should be even more open. This would show the futility of Putin's effort to recreate Tsarist Russia, or begin the recreation of Tsarist Russia. We've only seen the beginnings of that. Success in Ukraine might easily be followed by other extensions in Georgia, certainly, and heaven forbid, an attempt to take back the Baltic states, which after all were taken in 1940 by Stalin. And so the Stalin metaphor that I've used in terms of understanding what's in Putin's head, I haven't rejected that possibility that could be what the attempt, and that could well be bring us all into war. Let us hope not. But if we allow countries in and give them or support them in what they need to defend themselves, but also to put the alliance in a position better to support them, is the best means to peace. We should plan for supporting a post-Putin regime if one comes about, and a regime in Russia that agrees to withdraw from territories taken by force, by aggression, and to get a new Russia to resubscribe to a rules-based order in Europe and the Atlantic area. These are very high objectives, to be sure, but we need to think and plan for a post-Putin regime should that come about. The new Cold War that we're in may not end soon, but hopefully it won't take as long as it took to unwind the first Cold War. Steadfast collaboration by NATO, EU, and other European countries is absolutely essential in making that happen. I'll close my formal remarks here and welcome not only questions for which I will try to formulate answers, but also if you have different points of view from those that I have expressed. But you've heard Paul Viotti, not speaking for the US government, certainly, nor my university, just speaking as an independent actor, one who has studied and worries about war, who's been in one, Vietnam, for my generation. Which is a war that should not have been fought. I could go into a greater length on that point, but to bring us back to Russian attack on Ukraine and what our responses might be, going back to the title which Ahmet gave me, European Defense Against Before and After Russian Invasion in Ukraine, US, NATO, and Europe. Thank you for the opportunity to express my views.
Thank you very much, Professor Viotti, for your comments and speech on the issue. Begüm, Kurtuluş Hocam, if you have any questions with you, we can ask and we can discuss. In the meantime, if anyone, as Professor Viotti said, can contribute to the topic from our or your viewpoint.
Thank you very much, Professor Öztürk. So thank you, Professor Viotti. It was a great conversation, and I'm very much enlightened by your points, and it's great hearing your insights and opinions, not only as a scholar but also as a practitioner. So it was great. Thank you. Actually, I have a bunch of questions, but I will not ask all of them. Just to start the conversation here, I will start with asking a question. By the way, my colleagues are of course free to open their voice their questions, and on the other side, our audience is free to write their questions to the chat room. So we would check them and we would try to ask as much as possible to Professor Viotti. So I have a bunch of questions in my mind, but just to start with, we know NATO is in the center of all the hot debates about the Ukrainian crisis from the very beginning. And actually, it's somehow, it's part of the problem. So the expansion, the enlargement of NATO is being regarded as one of the provocateur of Russia in order to start an invasion towards Ukraine. But on the other hand, we know that with this crisis, NATO has been not started, but maybe restarted to be considered as a main security umbrella for European countries. And even till last year, there were many debates about creating kind of a European army. For example, Macron was voicing that kind of concerns that NATO was kind of not working, and maybe Europe should meet its own security mechanism with its own institutions. And what I can see from here that actually this crisis somehow helped NATO to restore itself or to reposition itself to somehow it's maybe benefited for NATO to show itself, to position itself as a legitimate security organization, because we know, also for the Ukrainian crisis, yes, it's part of the problem, but also many scholars and also the Ukrainians are saying that if we were a NATO member, then Russia could not dare to attack us, so it would be kind of a deterrence. So what do you think about it? I would like to hear about your insights about the situation. So can we say that NATO has become more powerful after this crisis? And on the other hand, like the creating kind of a European army, is it feasible? Do you believe that Europeans can meet their security concerns by themselves? Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'll start by returning to the origins of NATO, as Lord Ismay, the British diplomat, very undiplomatically expressed. The purpose of NATO was to keep the Americans in, because the United States has a history of being late to world wars, to keep the Russians out, the Soviet Union then seen as the threat. And then the other, I hesitate to say because it's overtaken by events, to keep the Germans down. But the Germans, having been defeated in the Second World War in 1949 or 48, whenever it was he said that, probably 1949 when the institution was created, dealing still with a resurgent Germany was on the minds of statespersons at that time. But two of those elements remain, keeping the Americans in and the Russians out. With respect to keeping the Americans in and European worries that I picked up from your comments about would the Americans be there in NATO, and certainly former President Trump did his best, it seems, to undermine the confidence of our European allies. President Biden he was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for some period of time before becoming vice president and before becoming president. And so he's a more conventional thinker. I happen to agree with him. Maybe I'm a conventional thinker about these things. European security is also American security. If we wind up coming into two world wars because we had been isolating ourselves from European concerns, that was not the US interest at the time, as I've come to understand it historically, clearly not a personal witness to that particular period of time. But certainly Trump, there's only 2 years between him and me, same generation, and yet something absent in his knowledge about these things. I can remember in the kindergarten in a public school when they would tell us that the United States had to understand that the oceans could no longer keep us away from conflicts and that we needed through the UN to be working on these issues. In fact, a UN flag was taken into my kindergarten room presented by Mrs. Lockhart from the United Nations Association, and it was put right next to the American flag. Symbolically, that was significant in terms of the socialization of people like me. And I grew up in New York State just as President Trump did. But he obviously was not given that kind of information, or if he was oblivious to it, as he is to many things. And so we're in a repair period, clearly, that Biden has implemented, helped in this sense, in a curious way, by Putin's actions that make it clear that the United States should be a part of this. At least most of us on this side of the Atlantic have that view. But keeping the Americans in is one of Biden's purposes. But Europeans have reason to wonder, well, what if Mr. Trump comes back, or somebody with a similar nationalist point of view, nationalist isolationist point of view, depending on how you wish to refer to it. And one can have no solid assurance on that point, since we do have free elections. At least so far we do. We have a major domestic issue with respect to democratic forms and democratic institutions that are under attack, particularly by social media, some of which basically are played on Russian television. The state networks like to quote certain of our commentators. Unfortunately, those commentators, like Tucker Carlson, for example, on Fox News, which is watched by too many people who take it, much as many Russians who watch state television, as somehow the truth, when it's fact mostly disinformation. And the people who used to be good journalists, increasingly like Chris Wallace, have even left that network. So we have a major domestic issue. If we could only have truth-telling, it might be useful. Back in the day when I came up, there were only 3 networks here, and they all more or less said the same thing, and they weren't controlled by the state. They were private sector networks, and they aimed in journalistic ways to be truth-tellers, not creators of fake news. So we have an issue there looking into the future. We have to live in the present in any event. And so let's do what we can, not only to strengthen NATO. On my side of the Atlantic, we need to work to maintain, I don't care, Republican or Democrat, who will continue to serve U.S. interest. I'm not taking a partisan view on this, but I am sad that the Republican Party that I knew has been corrupted from a misinformed right wing. That's my personal view, and I'm hoping that a Republican Party could reemerge, because I happen to believe in a 2-party system. I say that as a political scientist, as well as personally. So be that as it may, I hope. Let me let you follow up if at some point that I've missed in your question.
No, thank you very much, Professor Viotti. It's nice hearing you. Thanks. So we also have some questions in the YouTube channel, live broadcast. To start with, I can ask Şamil Göktuğ Akay writes, but this is a question, I don't know, maybe this is an interpretation, but the Soviets did everything the West wanted. They dissolved the USSR, gave independence to others, except capitalism. However, despite all this, NATO continued to expand towards the Russian border. I'm not sure about the Soviets did everything the West wanted. I don't know if you agree with me or not. I think, yes, this is not a real question, but the kind of a contribution. So if you want to say a few words on this, do you believe that the Soviets did everything they wanted? They accept capitalism and everything. But our student, I guess, says, despite all this, NATO continued to expand towards the Russian border. So do you believe Russia did everything that the West wanted it to be, or?
And let me be clear, after 1992, we talk no longer of the Soviet Union, but to Russia. And certainly the early Russian leadership was more open to the West, and indeed allowed Western corporations to enter Russia. I think the West could have done more, the United States could have done more to support the building of an economic structure that would be more durable in its time. So I can be somewhat critical of the lack of aid, but we even had, I even know a judge now retired who was going regularly over to Russia to consult on juridical matters, how the court system would operate. You know, he happened to be a bankruptcy court judge himself, was the chief judge in the bankruptcy court in Denver. So how Russia would deal with bankruptcies that occur in a free market system was part of what he was advising. So we had a lot of people doing things, but I really would separate the question of NATO expansion or NATO enlargement. It was responsive to countries that had been dominated during the Soviet period and feared a resurgent Russia might again extend itself. And so what's cause and what's effect is the question here. You know, if your fear of aggression from Russia leads you to want to join NATO and NATO allows you in, that's the effect of the fear based upon, you know, what happened during the Cold War period. Or is that then a cause of Russia in the form of Putin going back against the West for overly expanding its grasp or its encroachment into the Russian sphere? I really don't think that, while that's really secondary in some ways, as I see Putin, I think he has a larger agenda. I think he simply wants to restore Russia. And indeed, his name will be in Russian history at the same level of the czars. When I was in St. Petersburg and went to the Hermitage Museum there, beautiful works of art, the old Winter Palace. And I was asking our tour guide, who was about 27-year-old, young fellow, from my point of view, young fellow anyway, who I said, well, is there a Romanov still around who aspires to become the new czar? And his answer was, yes, Vladimir Putin. I was struck by that because here's somebody who's on a tour. He didn't know who I was and speaking that openly against Tsar Putin. So for what it may be worth, I think it's that czarist imagery in his mind. And if we can bring Stalin in as well in terms of expanding and maintaining the what was then the Soviet Union. So I think that much more than Western encroachment. Western encroachment then comes in, oh, well, clearly you can't trust the West because they'll take advantage of you if your guard is down. I understand that argument, but I think it's primarily the czarist recreation that's in his mind.
I totally agree with you.
Just a minute, Begüm. Can I ask a question before I also give a chance to Dr. Melikşah Kaçar for his question? But before him, can I ask you that, do you think the Western governments, including US governments, maybe it's from Clinton administration to the present day, and also European governments have been so soft on Russians as they fed Russian economy with gas, with oil, and with other sort of economic ties? And do you think it has been so naive to try to Russia make it a part of the Western world and Western or neoliberal economy or a European peace? What's your opinion on that, please?
That's a good question because it relates to two different theories or approaches to international relations. The realist one is you keep your powder dry and keep your strength up there. The liberal one is that you can somehow create commitment to universal norms, or norms at least within the European and Atlantic area, and one can rely on those. And so there's always a tension between the two. The English School of International Relations tries to carve a middle path, a via media, between the liberal and the realist. And so I guess I'm there because I studied, as I mentioned before, with a realist and a liberal constructivist. And so I try to do both, which is problematic at times. But to get to the empirical, when I was serving as a deputy political advisor in the U.S. European Command in Stuttgart, it was a time when the Germans were considering importing oil and gas and pipeline from Russia. The American position was, don't do that. You will become dependent upon Russia. That will limit your ability to react. That's a more realist position. The liberal position was, well, if you can have Germany and Russia in bed together in an economic sense, then maybe Russia won't attack. Its interdependence, its interconnectedness, that those things keep states from going to war. And now the realists say, well, we were right. Look what Putin is doing. I'm not taking that position that the realists are right, but a balance between the two seems to be an essential element. And so my response is that we may have been more or less severe in relation to a Russia that we were trying to cultivate on economic, social, and cultural terms. That's the liberal image. And so maybe they'll come around, but rather slow to recognize who Putin really was. Still a pipe dream that he was not going to depart fundamentally from the Gorbachev style and then followed by Yeltsin and so on. And instead, we have what we have. Realists would have opposed making yourself dependent upon oil and gas from Russia. They would have said, if you're going to cultivate Russia, cultivate it in other ways that don't make you so dependent. But history is history, and that's what we've done. And so Russia is indeed in the lead on that by limiting Germany and the other countries that depend upon Russian oil and gas.
Thank you. Melikşah?
Yeah, Melikşah. And then Professor Bekerol is raising hand.
Sure.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Next.
Sir, okay. Sir, first of all, thank you for your presentation. My question is about the economical aspect of this conflict. As you know, there is an attack on Russian economy with international sanctions, but also there is a digital attack via hacking or piracy. I believe it's a derivative of a Vietnam-era combat tactic. Bleed your opponent enough so they will force to surrender. But this time it is one of the greatest economic attack world has ever known. As a veteran yourself, you experienced the US, dare I say, failed strategies, such as search and destroy or MACV, military assistant command intelligence tactics, which, as you know, much better than any of us, of course, unite the opponent against the common enemy. What if this will unite Russia and China, is the main concern of us, Russia and China against common enemies such as NATO and or US? And can we predict that this will be the future of wars, proxy military wars and all-out economy-based attack on an opponent? Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm glad you've opened it to China. I'll briefly comment on Vietnam. It's a war that didn't need to be fought. In Europe, we identified Tito as our communist because he broke with Stalin. And so we were able to deal with, quote, communist regimes, unquote, in Europe, a regime in Europe, but, to the extent to which Romania was less subservient than other Warsaw Pact countries, we could applaud that at the time. That's going back into Cold War history. But in Vietnam, we somehow could not identify Ho Chi Minh as our kind of communist. He'd visited the United States in a more recent visit I took to Ho Chi Minh City, which I knew as Saigon, to the museum there. They have his Jeffersonian, Thomas Jefferson quotations on democracy that he had used. And so what we were unable at the time to deal with that because we felt that he would be subservient to China, which was totally stupid because indeed there's no love lost then or now between Vietnam and China. And so that he would be a slave there. And also there was a sense in which we at the time thought China and the Soviet Union were totally unified as communists, which the Sino-Soviet split didn't become apparent until the mid-1960s or thereabouts. And so there's a bit of history there, but the United States could have made Ho Chi Minh our communist. That's my personal view. And dealt with China separately and indeed supported Vietnamese independence in Southeast Asia. But we didn't have a European Tito notion when it came to Vietnam. So that's my personal view on that war. And also, you don't fight a war that you can't win. So setting aside the diplomatic option that I mentioned vis-a-vis Ho Chi Minh, when we were in war, we didn't want to bomb targets that might bring the Soviets or Chinese into the war, but particularly the Soviets were supporting. So we did not attack Haiphong or other locations. We did not invade North Vietnam to take out the regime. And if you're going to fight a war, you don't do one with your hands tied. Don't fight wars that you're going to tie your hands on because you're going to lose. And another dimension is that the nationalist element, we actually strengthened Vietnamese nationalism by being the outsider, the new French from the Vietnamese point of view. We were no different, maybe even worse from their perspective at the time. So those are some of my thoughts as a veteran of that particular war. I was in intelligence in Saigon at that time in what was the 7th Air Force. You mentioned MACV. We were part of Military Assistance Command Vietnam. I opposed the war before I went. In my own way, I opposed it while I was there, not to do anything that disrupted anything, but I had orders. I was a military officer, and that was my duty to be there. And I was fortunate that I was more in a journalist position. I would write reports on what was happening in the countries I was assigned, which as a lieutenant were Cambodia and Thailand. And eventually I got to write more on what was going on in Vietnam, but it was a factual-based job as opposed to actually targeting or any. So I was fortunate that I didn't have to deal with those questions. So in the second part, now I touched on Vietnam. Remind me where I was in terms of what you wanted to know further.
So thank you very much. Actually, yeah, as a veteran, we are also thrilled to hear about your experiences too, not only your opinions, but also your experiences too. Thank you very much. So I'm giving the word to Professor Bekaroğlu, and I will continue with some of the questions with the YouTube channel later.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Viotti. Thank you for being with us tonight. It was an enlightening talk. Well, I have two questions, and actually they are connected. You said that Putin he's kind of narcissist in extreme, and he doesn't have kind of rationality, as we know. And this is scary, right? Horrifying, because he has nuclear weapons in his hands. So when I listen to you, And imagine that we have this guy who doesn't have rationality and who has to leave a legacy in history, like Ivan the Terrible or Peter the Great. He wants to be Vladimir the Great, right? So he cannot accept any other option but succeed in this campaign against Ukraine. So he cannot fail, right? But the things on the ground is not going well for Russia, right? They were expecting much faster outcome in this campaign, but it's been 2 weeks and probably it will go on. I don't know if Ukrainians will be continue to fight, but they are having help, right? And we know that Russia in the 90s in Chechnya, they were like planning to finish everything in 2 hours, but it took like months, and in the end they had this ceasefire, not even a victory, right? So we have on the one hand Putin. He wants to leave a legacy. He wants to be Vladimir the Great, but the things are not going well on the field. So, and he has nuclear weapons. So what do you expect he can do in the end if he sees that that he's not going to get what he wants? And connected to that, about the sanctions, well, they are very comprehensive, and probably Putin was not expecting something as comprehensive as this. But sanctions may have impact if these sanctions trigger division among regime elites and popular protests among people. But in Russia, none of these are likely, right? Because Putin has been taking necessary measures against all these threats for 20 years. But again, as Melik Shah said, these sanctions are unprecedented. And as the time go on, as the Ukrainians try as much as they can to stop Russians, and as the time passes, these sanctions will have more impact at home in Russia. So what are your expectations in that sense? Will Russian people, for example, may have popular protests, or do you expect any kind of elite division in Russia? Thank you.
On that, I mentioned my earlier, what I call pipe dreams, would be either a palace coup, the elites you're referring to. I don't know whether that would be oligarchs per se, or is it the FSB people, I like to say KGB, it's the same thing, surrounding Putin. It's unlikely that that will occur, but I certainly would approve of it if he's removed from his position, because he's not in a psychological position to serve his country in a way that would serve, in short, its own interest, Russian interests. So hopefully some Russians at the elite level would understand that, and that's for the right reason, quite apart from their own desire to move into power position. Whatever motivates them becomes important. As far as the popular people and what they understand, I think we should do a much better job of penetrating Freudian slip, Russian media with during the Cold War, Radio Free Europe, Voice of America were penetrating what was behind the so-called Iron Curtain countries with language-specific news reports, which as an American, at least I was told was truthful, but because they were propaganda agents, could not broadcast in the United States. But so far as I know, certainly with an American slant to the news perhaps, but nevertheless factual reporting. And so what's going on in Ukraine needs to be reported, if not through radio, which was a technology of an earlier period, but may still be operative. I don't know those questions. How we can penetrate through social media and other means in order to spread the word as to what is happening in Ukraine at Russia's hands as a counter to what they hear on state television. People in my age group, the older ones, are not likely to engage in social media there any more than they do here, although I'm more attentive to it because I'm a scholar than others would be. And so the senior people may still be slaves to state television and get Putin's version of what the truth is. In other words, disinformation. But to the extent to which the word can get out through those means, through family connections in Ukraine and other ways, to build some resistance within Russia that takes into account the fact that the people are suffering economically because of their leader. That would be the major theme that would have to be part of this discourse. I don't know what we're doing in that regard. We, not just the United States, but other NATO countries, but it would be certainly something that I would support. On the use of nuclear weapons, horrendous thought, because that does open Pandora's box, to use a metaphor that we often use in the US at least, because where will it stop? Are we simply going, and what are we thinking? What are we planning about that as a response to that? Is the use of nuclear, or for that matter, chemical weapons, enough to kind of stop at the border? Or do we actually move into Ukraine, and so long as they have a government that invites us, do it legally as such? I don't know what those deliberations are at the leadership levels. I'm sure they're going on. I know that much. And so tactical nuclear weapons, so-called battlefield weapons, still have tremendous impacts. I don't know how well developed the Russian nuclear arsenal is in terms of usable, so-called usable nuclear weapons. When I did a study going in Europe about European acceptance of more usable nuclear weapons, Europeans tended to say, well, if they're more usable, they're more likely to be used, and thereby opposed the kind of modernization of nuclear weapons that was being proposed in our US national laboratories at the time. I brought that message back. It wasn't necessarily well received for a political scientist to return to the engineers who are developing weapons, that they're not going to be well received in Europe. And so I share that with you. I don't have answers to the questions that I've posed in response to your questions, but I hate to think that we'll move into that area. But like you, I have concern about an extreme narcissist who cannot accept defeat and then turns to the use of these weapons, because deterrence is based upon the assumption of a rationality that you will not engage in something that will destroy yourself. It's a suicide pact, deterrence, a mutually assured destruction concept. And certain personalities may not be persuaded by that mad mutual assured destruction doctrine. And so I share your unease, if I perceive that correctly, on that point. To return to the part that I had forgotten to address China on the previous question, that, do I pronounce your name, Iktisat? Correctly?
Actually, Melikshah, sir. Melikshah. It's a hard name to pronounce it, but
I knew who asked the question. And for China, I worry a lot because there's a connection between what happens in Ukraine and happens in China. Part of it is, of course, Russia allegedly seeking support from China. I read, although it may not be true, seeking even military equipment to replace what they've lost in the campaign. But looking to Taiwan, and I've visited Taiwan on several occasions and talked to people in their government, and have published a bit about Taiwan in a book that I did on U.S. foreign policy and national security. There's a history there that we need not go through right now, but in terms of the U.S. relation to Taiwan and the normalization of relations with Beijing, our policy over the years had always been to discourage Taiwan from unnecessarily provoking Beijing, and Beijing not unnecessarily to threaten Taipei. And so this becomes a bit unglued in the current environment. Americans are not necessarily students of international relations like all of us are. They also don't study history much. And so those are problems that I'm not going to be able to change in terms of in the US. But the US understanding of the importance of Taiwan to American defense arrangements is problematic. It is not just an island off of China. Why is the US interested in that? An echo of those who say, why is the US interested in Ukraine? There's a larger European history and understanding that you all have that I share. But the whole defense and security architecture in East Asia and the Pacific, after all, the United States was involved in World War II in 2 major theaters, and the construction afterward. One of the success stories for American foreign policy was to replace dictatorships with democracies in 3 rather major countries: Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. All had been under dictatorships, under autocratic regimes prior. So I view those as local success stories for the Democrats in those countries, but also for American foreign policy. To keep countries there from acquiring nuclear weapons, the United States said, we'll be there to defend you, to avoid proliferation of weapons. And so Japan, which certainly has the capability to develop them, chose not to. South Korea, in spite of attacks from North Korea, attacks meaning in this case even flying missiles over, a variety of provocative issues that also threaten Japan, South Korea, to my knowledge, doesn't try to get nuclear weapons either, and nor does Taiwan. They're under an American extended deterrence umbrella, as we used to call it. If we allow Taiwan to fall, Taiwan to be taken by China, what are the people in Japan to think? Can they depend upon the United States for its ultimate defense? What's going to happen in South Korea? Now, if Japan chose as a result of this new insecurity, because they can't rely upon the Americans to develop their own nuclear weapons, what's the reaction likely to be in China to that? And so not defending Taiwan destabilizes an entire region that has been stabilized by the balance of power between the United States and its East Asian allies. Taiwan is technically not an ally. It's kind of like Ukraine outside of the normal orbit, which frightens me a little bit, vis-a-vis China, whilst at the same time, the United States needs somehow to rekindle good relations with China through trade and commerce and other kinds of exchange. But we're dealing with another leader. I'm not going to call him a narcissist. I don't know enough about Chairman Xi to make that statement, but we're dealing with a very difficult person who has his own idea, his own legacy of reuniting China, get rid of that renegade province, as they call Taiwan. So we're in a dangerous period, Turkey less so than, because you're not as committed in that sense to East Asia as the United States is. But what my remedy for this is not strategic ambiguity. Let China figure out what we might do. That's okay as a public position. I don't need to know what the United States does in case of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. But I want the leaders, Chairman Xi and others around him, to be informed by the United States President, our ambassador, our Secretary of State, Defense, Chairman, Chiefs of Staff, whoever are the relevant people to their counterparts, to make clear that any invasion of Taiwan will be the starting of a war with the United States. The way to avoid war is to prepare for one and to make very clear what your response would be. Strategic, in that sense, clarity, not strategic ambiguity, is the best means to maintain peace in the entire security structure in East Asia. We do not need a destabilized East Asia. And at the same time, we need to be developing positive and diplomatic and economic, social, cultural, all of those relations. So I combine realism and liberalism in my effort, as I indicated to fellow academics following the English school. I'm not here as an advocate of the English school or of England. I'm here simply saying that they have nicely combined both the realist and the liberal. The world we live in that has no world government has to have a balance between both modes of thought. At least that's the way I approach these rather complex issues.
Thank you. I regret to say that we are actually kind of running out of our time. So, but we have still many questions more. So, I'd like to ask for shortening the questions and the answers, maybe like squeezing it a bit in the final part. So, I see two of my colleagues raised hands. As far as I saw, Professor Gilboy was the first. If I'm not wrong, I don't know, Gizem. I think Professor Gilboy is the first, and then we will move on with Professor Aytaç, Bilgin Aytaç. So I'm regretfully asking to shorten in the questions. And also,
well.
I'm so sorry. I mean, we would like to hear your insights like hours and hours, but unfortunately we have a schedule.
Well, I like to joke. Fellow professors, you hit our button in the arm, and we can talk for 50 minutes on any question, whether we know anything or not.
Yeah, you know, ISI, especially the ISI sections, like 15 minutes, sometimes it's 12 minutes, so just squeeze in. So, okay, Professor Gilboy, please go on.
Thank you very much, Begin, and thank you very much, Professor Viotti. We have something in common. I also teach in National Military Academy in Istanbul, and I do teach on Clausewitz and theory of war too. Mm-hmm. You have mentioned Clausewitz and Clausewitzian analysis, and I was amazed to hear from a colleague about Clausewitz. And I believe we have to separate that between war and warfare. That Russia is failing on both fronts, like at war and at warfare. At war,
I'm not hearing the question. There's some interference.
There was some disconnection.
Sorry.
Can you repeat it again, please?
Russia is failing on the Clausewitzian triangle on state level, on military level, on public level, as we have seen till now. The problem is that I'm asking, I will ask about that one. I also have another question later, but the thing is that the problem is that how would be Russia after peace? Like ending the war is the problem for Russia now. It's not making the war, but ending the war, because it has no counterpart to sign peace at Ukraine. And at the international level, it is so weak. Russia's position is so weak. So what will happen after the peace? Because if Putin signs a peace under these circumstances, Russia will be blown out, I believe. it will be a major problem both for Russia and for the world, I believe, because we cannot say who will come or what will happen after Putin. I want to hear your thoughts about that. The second thing is that about warfare, as we have seen, Russia is completely unprepared for light infantry tactics. And it seems that waging war, modern war, is very problematic. So I believe this may contribute to use of force in the future, that the states may think twice about waging wars. I believe this is problematic too, and I also want to hear your thoughts on that. And a final question is about United States.
It seems that the questions.
Yes, but
all right, go on.
Okay, let's do that. It's a final question. Can we say that Biden is bidding for a new hegemony, in which we may say that he's ending the war on terror, the previous doctrine, and he's starting a new doctrine about the defense of democracy? Like maybe say that United States will position itself as the arsenal of democracy, like Franklin Roosevelt did. May it be that this will cause a new world politics, new world system, or maybe say new Cold War? These are my questions.
I would say, looking to
go
the
with
last,
the flow, I say.
And I may have to ask you to remind me of some of the points that you're raising. But basically, with respect to Biden, I don't see him as the author of a new American hegemony at all. I think he would rather attend to domestic politics, but it's still but he recognizes United States commitments and interests in what happens outside of American borders. But he has a program, and he has a very difficult Congress legislature to deal with, although technically his party has a very slim majority in the Senate, only because the vice president votes in the Senate to break a tie, and a very slim majority in the House of Representatives, which has kept him from his own programs of a more social and liberal orientation. So it's been frustrating for him. Most presidents do find that when they confront problems in getting a domestic agenda abroad, they have greater freedom of action externally in foreign policy, but I don't see him as trying to establish a new American hegemony. With respect to, in fact, he'd like to strengthen NATO and the other organizations weakened by his predecessor, also in that category of narcissists. I would have to add, I didn't have to add it, but I need to, because the great fear of a return to that in the future and undoing everything that Biden has done, mostly because Biden had done them, much as Trump undid everything he could that Obama had done, mostly because Obama had done them in that respect. So, narcissists are problematic in the extreme. I don't mind narcissists because many of us are or can be, but in the extreme. I've made that point perhaps too much. With respect to Russia, and a change of circumstance. How do you get out of Ukraine? The so-called off-ramp, as the press is using the term, seems elusive rather. And so we have to plan for this, different contingencies. A Russian defeat with Putin still there, or following one of my pipe dreams that somehow the regime has changed, either due to the elites intervening as what palace coup or revolution. But certainly if it takes either of the other, we need to get back to where we were when Gorbachev was there and Yeltsin, the transition there, attempting as best we could to bring Russia back into Europe and into a rule-based order with good relations between the United States and Russia. And I would say the same with China. You didn't ask about China, but the U.S. has to think globally. And in the beginning, you had one other point. I can't remember what the question was.
It's about the Russian military, like
the warfare,
yeah, the warfare stuff,
and
like,
the Clausewitzian triangle that you referred to.
And also, I'm asking about that. Would the states think twice going into war in that circumstances? Like the light infantry is quite strong now. This is we see. So it's easy to suffer in war. So why would you choose war?
Well, it's a central question, and one would have thought that we would have learned from World Wars I and II. And Russia, after all, suffered 9.5 million, I think the number is, of losses in World War I, some 20 million in World War II. And here we are going into further warfare. And in the West, we also had tremendous losses. The West seems still to remember that, didn't need to be reminded of the cost of war by another contingency in Ukraine. But somehow that kind of rational logic doesn't seem to work all the time, which is why liberalism alone doesn't seem to work, much as I wish it would, the rule-based order. But still, there has to be a realist component to it, for what it may be worth.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Viotti. So we are going with Professor Bilgin Aytaç.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask a little bit additional question to Professor Gülboy's evaluation about the new warfare environment. You generally in your first part of your presentation, you have talked about this just warfare, how it is just for supporting Ukraine and Ukraine for this Russian aggression, and how the international law can be reasoning. But the thing is, I didn't really catch up how this strategic clarity that you have mentioned, not the strategic ambiguity, but strategic clarity will be evident in a concept of, for example, in the enlargement of NATO, because as other professors has told, especially Begüm Hoca has told us that Ukraine, because of the enlargement of the Ukrainian entrance to the NATO, Russia is feeling threatened by its nationalism and also by its strategic aims for the Black Sea situation. And the thing is, if the question is coming from here, if there is a new kind of just war environment, do you think that NATO is going to intervene like in another process, not just like a just war, but maybe responsibility to protect for humanitarian crisis? Because this is also a kind of new war that has created not only by national armies, but also with national militias and the other groups that are entering to the field. What do you think of that?
Yeah, for Russia, it's not a new war. We could look at Syria to see how Russia conducted warfare there. And earlier incursions in Georgia and Crimea. The concept of going against population centers is not new either. Certainly in World War II, it was very prominent, and also central to what happened in Chechnya within Russian Federation, and also in Syria. And so all of these are really very old forms of warfare that we would have thought would have not been used in the 21st century, but they indeed still are. Sorry for that. Interrupted by scam messages, we call them. Somebody selling something we're trying to. But so I don't see, so the old just war theory that developed over the millennia, which underlies our international law, I still see as current, even if they're not followed. As I like to sometimes put it, if even though the 10 commandments are broken every day, doesn't mean they're no less commandments, to use a religious metaphor here. And so principles of international law, though violated, doesn't make them any less principles. Indeed, the termination of the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, in 1940 did not end their sovereignty. Sovereignty is a right claimed by states, and when it was violated, they took up positions in exile. I could see this happening in Ukraine. I don't want it to happen in Ukraine. I want the Ukraine to prevail over its Russian invaders, but that has to be part of the plan. Sovereignty is a beautiful concept because it's not a factual one. De facto, the Soviet Union controlled the Baltic states, but as a matter of sovereignty, we and other states, meaning the United States, and I don't know what Turkey's position and other positions were, but basically, I think the exile governments were in London, that we recognized as the legitimate governments of, and indeed at the end of the Cold War, they came back in. And sovereignty had never been extinguished, is my point. And so Putin cannot extinguish the sovereignty of Ukraine, as I understand the concept. They can violate it, but that doesn't extinguish it. And so all of the traditional theories and principles of just war still have a place in our discourse. But in terms of the Black Sea, I think you mentioned, so who is threatening whom? I wasn't exactly clear from your question what you meant there.
The threatening, I was saying that Ukraine, the enlargement, you have suggested that the enlargement of the NATO by the membership of Ukraine will be, am I understanding this right? I think you are suggesting that also Ukraine and other parties need to be added to the NATO enlargement. So, but Russia is feeling the threat of this enlargement, as I suggest. So, this is going to create a challenge for strategically, and how NATO can strategically be clear by this fact, strategic clarity.
I first of all want to be clear. I am not advocating NATO membership for any of these countries. They are the ones, to include Finland and Sweden, who need to figure out what they want to do. And then it's up to NATO to ponder and deliberate and think through the implications of that. To the extent to which Georgia and Ukraine as NATO members would further threaten Putin or Russia, I think I don't see either having the capability to threaten anyone other than perhaps each other, which isn't likely to occur. They're both small countries in term and with limited military capabilities. And the fact that Ukraine has been so successful in slowing down the onslaught of what everybody thought was a rather impossible foe, Russia. The threat is coming from Russia to Ukraine and Georgia, not the other way round. And so joining NATO, to the extent to which, is NATO planning to invade Russia? I don't think so. I haven't heard anyone that being on any part of the agenda. So if a NATO country invades Russia, that would cause a great problem for NATO. It's the reverse, in other words, of Article 5. Article 5 is a defensive alliance that if any of the members are invaded, that the North Atlantic Council has to meet and decide what to do, to include possibly the use of force. That's a very defensive alliance. And so I don't see the threat. Now, if it's perceived as a threat because their public media, which the state controls, represents that point of view, you can create the illusion of a threat, and that is dangerous. So I agree with you on that point. If you create the illusion in Russia of a real threat from Ukraine so far hasn't even extended beyond its borders. Mm-hmm. It hasn't attacked targets in Belarus. It hasn't attacked targets in Russia, and yet is being invaded. And so there's a certain constraint there, partly because it doesn't have the capability really to conduct warfare against Russia. That's a very rational position that Zelensky is taking.
Are you seeing a kind of chance of NATO intervention to the area as a matter of defense, not by use of force?
Well, possibly. I've mentioned that if the Russians continue to attack supply lines to Ukraine, so long as Ukraine has a working government and an ability to receive, that could lead to strengthen the no-fly zone idea. I could see that happening. And there are some commentators, to include former Supreme Allied Commanders Europe, SACEUR, who have said that Russia will not start World War III if NATO countries take deliberate defensive actions. I don't know whether that's true or not. I'm not sure I want to test the hypothesis, but it is that it's being talked about at very senior levels means that it could well occur. I think for proper reasons, for defensive reasons. And then the great fear of transferring MiG fighters to Ukraine, because whose airfields are they taking off, and will that lead to a Russian attack upon NATO members and thereby invoke Article 5? We're in a very difficult period of time, but I can't predict what Putin would do, but I don't think he really wants to have a world war at the present. If he defeats Ukraine, will Georgia be next? Will the Baltic states be next? I don't know. I doubt that he would want to invade Poland. I doubt that he would want to invade Turkey. But these are all speculations. And when you win, you tend to, like a gambler, want to win more for what it may be worth.
Thank you very much.
Sure thing.
Thank you, Professor Viotti. Actually, we also have some other questions on the on our YouTube channel. So I just feel myself obliged to voice them up, but I guess we all covered most of the questions because we talked about the sanctions. So marriage and Alijan, for example, asks about the sanctions, their consequences on Russian people. I guess you answered this one. And also another question was about the military structure of the European countries. I think what this was about with my question, related with my question. And also, I'm just asking if you want to make some final comments, like in 1 minute or two in response to this, or like generally. Also, there was another question about one of the audience is asking if there can we talk about kind of a double standard towards the Ukrainian crisis and what we saw in the Bosnian War and in Middle East, for example. And also the other questions were like European states' expenditure and policies on military, especially Germany in the long run to counterbalance threats. I think it is also related with my first question. So maybe you want to conclude with some final remarks in response to these questions or in general view. And once again, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I will say this, and I meant to comment more explicitly earlier, when President Trump was undermining confidence within NATO and talk by the French and others to strengthen European defense. I certainly support strengthening European defense efforts. These are not at all at odds with a stronger NATO, but do provide Europe with a stronger voice in the comment, even within NATO. The reality is that the United States need not carry this burden as it sees itself carrying it alone, but a strong European defense is also in the US interest, I would say, not to compete with NATO, but to be compatible with it. And that can be worked diplomatically and otherwise. I guess I'm not sure I understand fully the Yugoslavia reference or to the war and two sides. Can you clarify that question?
Sure. The question is, why do you think? Sorry, Do you think world is reacting to war between Ukraine and Russia and acknowledging its horrors more than Yugoslavian war or anything that happened in the Middle East? So what I'm getting from this question is that somehow we saw maybe some ignorance of the Western world, the European states, to Bosnian War at first, the dissolution of Yugoslavia, and later the Middle East. But now we are seeing like the Ukrainian crisis is regarded as the greatest crisis after the Second World War. And also it can be related with the refugee crisis. So, you know, at the first time that the Europeans started to see all the refugees, they're like us. So because there was kind of a stereotype of a refugee coming from the Middle East or the other parts are like Afghanistan. So that one, and just like a very short answer.
Yeah, I will. Like, I'll do my best. You know, refugees are present in every war. And they require not just our heartfelt concerns for them, but our actually material support for them. And from what I can observe in the present crisis from Ukraine, precisely the generous opening, at least that's the way it's reported to me, by the countries in the region, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and others, and elsewhere in Europe, as refugees are finding new homes, they hope are temporary homes. However, many times refugees never return home. Of course, if many of their, in this case, the male population remains in Ukraine, those who survive the current would have a family reason for returning. But certainly refugees need the support human security, if you will, which I also feel strongly about. Going back to the problems of Yugoslavia, which broke up into separate components and mounted to a civil war, or was it a war among states? I think the OSCE wound up becoming a major player in the post-war, at least, construction and efforts to diplomatically to settle the issue. It wasn't in the same way a Ukrainian issue where Russia invades another sovereign state. It was already a state that had broken up and was seeking recognition for the sovereignty of the component parts, if I recall the timing correctly, as between Serbia and Croatia and the other states within the former Yugoslavia. And so NATO's involvement ultimately with air cover, those kinds of tactics was a response, and the United States was involved in that. But I don't see per se a contradiction because the two cases are so different for what it may be worth. Is there another issue before I make a final comment? Okay. Thank you very much. This has been great, and I really appreciate the invitation from Ahmet and all of you to speak. One of the strengths of my university comes from those who are our graduates, who go on in the academic world and in other pursuits in policy world too. And so I have the benefit of being a professor of some of them, and Ahmet may remember some of these other people. I'm going to be going to Italy to start a research project on Machiavelli, thanks to Roberto Belloni, who is a professor at the University of Trento, and also Stefes, who will be running a program in Berlin for the University of Colorado, and I hope to be there in the fall, I should say next spring in Berlin. So it'll be an opportunity, and I certainly hope in the course of these events sometime to get to come to see some of you in Turkey, and to welcome any of you who come to the United States, have a chance to come to Denver, which is the major city in the middle of the continental United States. We would welcome you at the Korbel School of International Studies, much as you've welcomed me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To conclude, if Begüm continues a little longer, I was going to take Russian side.
Okay.
I've been in freezing conditions here because we are based on Russian gas.
I knew that, and I was diplomatically avoiding that. I said other countries.
We had a snowstorm and freezing temperatures outside for the last few days. I put the heater off because of the noise it made before the speech, before the talk. I've been very glad to have you, Professor Viotti, with us, with my colleagues at our department. It was a very, very good privilege for us to listen to you and to get your ideas and your expertise on what's happening around us. Thank you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
See
Bye-bye.
you.
Till next time.
Istanbul.
Until
All
next
right.
time.